Have you ever wondered what happens when love turns into something darker, something you can't escape? What if the place you called home became the place where your nightmares began? It was 2013 in the quiet coastal town of Santa Cruz, California, where Alex and Sarah believed they had everything they could ever want. The sun-kissed skies, the cool ocean breeze, and the promise of a future together. Everything seemed perfect. But when they moved into their new apartment, nestled in a peaceful neighborhood, they were stepping into a reality far darker than they could have imagined. Alex and Sarah were madly in love. Their whirlwind romance had swept them off their feet, and before long, they decided to marry. They had barely spent time together before their vows, but they were eager to start a new chapter. Their families had blessed their decision, and they found what seemed like the perfect apartment to build their life together. The apartment had everything: charming, quiet, and in a neighborhood that felt almost too good to be true. The couple settled in quickly, the warmth of their new neighbors welcoming them with open arms. The laughter of children echoed in the streets, and the air was always filled with a sense of calm. It was the kind of place where you thought nothing could go wrong. A place that should have been a sanctuary. But beneath the surface of their newfound happiness, something else was waiting. Something that would soon unravel their lives in ways they couldn't foresee. Their story was just beginning. But every love story has a dark side, and in this one, that side was waiting just around the corner. As the days passed, the walls of their perfect home seemed to close in, and the warmth of their love began to turn cold. Sarah had imagined a life filled with romance, laughter, and endless moments of togetherness. She dreamed of quiet mornings with Alex, hand in hand on their honeymoon, and evenings spent curled up on the couch, sharing their hopes and dreams. But reality, as it often does, had other plans. Alex, once the attentive and loving fiancé, now seemed to fade into the background of her life. His job consumed him. He would leave before dawn and return long after the sun had set, often too exhausted to even exchange a word with Sarah. His focus was solely on his work, and Sarah felt the weight of neglect press down on her heart every day. In the beginning, she tried to fill the emptiness with thoughts of the future. Maybe things would get better once the honeymoon was over. But as the days stretched into weeks and weeks into months, that hope began to wither. She would sit alone in their apartment, the silence growing louder with each passing hour. The glow of the TV was the only thing that seemed to offer her any form of comfort, though even that couldn't drown out the aching loneliness that consumed her. Sarah tried to reach out. She connected with the neighbors, making small talk with other housewives and children in the neighborhood, but it wasn't enough. Every interaction felt shallow, like a temporary escape from the suffocating reality of her marriage. She would return home by 6 p.m., as if bound by some invisible force, to prepare for Alex's arrival, only to be met with his tired eyes and his distant presence. The apartment that once felt like a home began to feel like a prison. Each room seemed to reflect the growing distance between them, and Sarah's isolation deepened. She longed for the connection she thought she'd found with Alex, but it slipped further away with each passing day. She felt trapped, stuck in a relationship that no longer fulfilled her, but unable to break free. The love they once shared, so vibrant and bright, had been replaced by an ever-growing shadow of loneliness. And that shadow, as it crept into every corner of their home, began to cast something far darker, a feeling that there was something in the apartment more sinister than just silence, something that was waiting to make its presence known. But Sarah couldn't see it, not yet. The cracks in their marriage were deepening, and little did she know, the isolation she was feeling wasn't just coming from Alex's neglect. It was something much darker, something far more terrifying. It was supposed to be just a few days, a simple business trip to New York. Alex casually mentioned it one evening while Sarah was folding laundry, her mind wandering as she tried to fill the emptiness in their home. He would be gone for a while, but Sarah, feeling more alone than ever, couldn't help but wish she had been invited. Instead, Alex left, his suitcase in hand, with barely a glance back. The apartment felt colder the moment he was gone. The silence that had already grown between them now seemed louder, almost deafening. Sarah found herself lost in the echoes of her own thoughts, feeling more isolated than ever. The loneliness, once manageable, now consumed her entirely. It wasn't long before the isolation began to gnaw at her, pushing her toward a choice she would later regret. Sarah sought the comfort of another, someone who, for a fleeting moment, made her feel alive again. He was a neighbor, a man who had always been friendly but never crossed the line. Until now. One evening, in a fragile moment of weakness, Sarah invited him inside. One drink turned into another, and before she knew it, she had crossed a boundary she couldn't take back. But as the hours passed, so did the weight of her decision. She felt a strange unease creeping up her spine, as if the very air around her had changed. Just as quickly as it had started, her connection with the neighbor ended. She tried to push it aside, burying the guilt and shame deep within her, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was horribly wrong. That evening, just as Sarah was trying to calm her racing heart, the front door creaked open. It was Alex. He had returned early from his trip. An unexpected twist, an unspoken sense of dread that seemed to settle in the apartment like a heavy fog. Alex stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, his face drained of color. His eyes, once full of love, were now hollow with hurt. Sarah's blood ran cold as he looked at her, standing there in the living room, a stranger in his own home. The silence between them was suffocating. No words were needed. He had seen enough. Betrayal, raw and piercing, hung thick in the air. Alex turned and fled the apartment, slamming the door behind him, leaving Sarah standing frozen in the same spot, her heart shattering into pieces. The apartment, once a symbol of their love, now felt like a tomb, a place where the past was dead and the future seemed uncertain. Sarah was left alone, her thoughts a swirl of guilt and regret, consumed by the enormity of her mistake. She tried calling Alex, desperate to apologize, to somehow fix what she had broken, but each attempt was met with silence. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer, no sign of him. The weight of her actions hung like a shroud, suffocating her until there was nothing left but emptiness. And in that silence, in the darkness of her own mind, Sarah began to feel the first stirrings of something far worse than guilt. It was a presence, a cold, oppressive weight that settled into the very fabric of the apartment. She could feel it watching her, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her betrayal was only the beginning. The apartment was no longer just a home. It had become something else, something that fed on her sorrow. And as Sarah stood there, lost and broken, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The days following Alex's departure were a blur for Sarah. Guilt, self-loathing, and an overwhelming sense of loss swallowed her whole. She could still feel the weight of Alex's disappointed eyes, the look that said everything she had feared, everything she knew was true. She had shattered the one thing she had wanted to keep intact. The love that had once seemed unbreakable now felt fragile, like glass, and it had all fallen apart in her hands. In her loneliness, Sarah could see no way out. Her heart ached with every passing moment, and the guilt twisted inside her, a suffocating coil that tightened around her chest. She had ruined everything. Her marriage, her future, her chance at happiness. And now, there was nothing left to hold on to. The apartment, once a symbol of their love, now felt like a prison cold, suffocating space that echoed with the ghosts of what could have been. She had no one left, no one to turn to. And the silence of the apartment, the silence that had once been a comforting presence, now felt like a constant reminder of her failure. In the darkness of their bedroom, Sarah finally made her choice. She couldn't live with herself anymore. The pain, the betrayal, the regret, it was all too much. She found the rope, her hands trembling as she tied it to the ceiling fan. She didn't look back. As she stepped off the edge, the world around her seemed to fade, the last breath leaving her body as her soul became trapped in the apartment, forever lingering in the space she once shared with Alex. Hours later, Alex returned. He had hoped, foolishly, that things might somehow get better, that he could fix the broken pieces of their relationship. But as he stepped through the door, the weight of the apartment's silence hit him like a freight train. There was no sound, no warmth, no life. And then he saw her. Sarah's lifeless body hung from the ceiling, her eyes wide open, staring at him with an unspoken question, an accusation. It was as though she was waiting for him to answer, to explain why he had failed her, why he had abandoned her, why he had left her alone to drown in her own despair. Alex's world shattered in that instant. His heart, once filled with love, now ached with unbearable pain. He rushed to her, but it was too late. The woman he had loved, the woman he had promised to cherish forever, was gone. Overcome with grief, Alex performed the funeral rites, his hands shaking as he clung to the idea that somehow he could make it right. But deep down, he knew nothing could erase the cruelty of his neglect. His failure as a husband had led them to this, a tragedy that could never be undone. Unable to bear the crushing weight of the memories, Alex left the apartment. He couldn't stay. Every corner, every room held the echoes of their love and of Sarah's tragic end. He left it all behind, abandoning the apartment that had once been their sanctuary, hoping that somehow leaving would rid him of the memories that haunted him. But the guilt would follow him wherever he went. It was something he could never escape. And so Alex's life was forever changed, trapped in a cycle of grief and regret. The love they had shared was gone, and the apartment that had once been a place of happiness now stood empty, a haunting reminder of what had been lost. But Sarah's soul was not at rest. No, she lingered in the shadows of that apartment, waiting for Alex to return. And in the stillness of the night, if you listen closely, you can almost hear her whispering his name, begging for forgiveness, trapped in the web of her own tragic end. After Sarah's death, the apartment should have been empty, silent. But Alex soon realized that there are things far worse than silence. For nights on end, he lay in the dark, his eyes wide open, unable to escape the images of Sarah's lifeless body, her accusatory stare. But those images were nothing compared to the terror that would soon haunt him. It started as whispers, faint at first, as if carried on a breeze that didn't exist. He would hear her voice calling his name in the dead of night, soft and pleading. "Alex, please, forgive me. I'm sorry." The words echoed in his mind, followed by the sound of soft sobbing. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to exhaustion, but the voice grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just in his mind, it was in the apartment, filling the rooms with a sorrow so deep it chilled him to the bone. One night, he awoke to the unmistakable sound of crying, a desperate, heart-wrenching sobbing. He opened his eyes, and there she was. Sarah's ghost stood at the foot of his bed, her translucent form shuddering with grief. Her eyes were wide and empty, her lips trembling as she wept silently. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, but his body refused to move. He couldn't look away, couldn't breathe, as the ghostly figure of his wife lingered in the darkness. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. But she didn't respond. She simply stood there, her ghostly form flickering like a broken light, until, with a soft cry, she vanished into the shadows. The next morning, Alex couldn't shake the image of Sarah's spirit. He could still feel the coldness of her presence, the weight of her sorrow. He knew then that she hadn't gone. She was trapped, unwilling or unable to leave the place where she had died. Terrified and desperate, Alex sought out a spiritual medium, a woman known for her ability to communicate with spirits and perform cleansing rituals. The medium arrived with her tools, her eyes wide with suspicion as she stepped into the apartment. "This place is cursed," she murmured under her breath, her voice tinged with fear. She set to work, performing rituals to cleanse the apartment, to banish Sarah's restless spirit. But every time she chanted a prayer or burned sage, the air grew heavier, colder. The very walls seemed to vibrate with an eerie energy. The medium looked up at Alex, her face pale. "She's not leaving. Your wife's spirit is angry, and it's trapped here, tied to this place by your regret." The medium's warning echoed in Alex's mind as the days wore on, each one more unbearable than the last. The supernatural occurrences didn't stop. At night, he would hear footsteps pacing through the halls, or the sound of something scratching at the door. It was as if Sarah was trying to reach him, to make him feel her pain. Meanwhile, the building's other residents began to notice strange happenings of their own. The sounds of footsteps in empty corridors, faint whispers in the night, and the strange sighting of a black cat roaming the hallways. The cat appeared at random, slinking through the darkness like a shadow, its eyes glowing eerily in the moonlight. Some residents began to whisper that the cat was no ordinary animal, that it was a manifestation of Sarah's spirit, her rage taking form in the creature's cold, unblinking gaze. The second floor, where Alex and Sarah had lived, became a place of dread. Neighbors avoided it, murmuring about the strange noises that came from within the apartment, the flickering lights, the disembodied cries. They spoke in hushed tones about the presence that lingered in the hallways, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Rumors spread like wildfire. People claimed to have seen Sarah's ghost at the windows, her face pressed against the glass, her mouth twisted in anguish. Others swore they could hear her crying in the dead of night, even though the apartment stood empty. It didn't take long for the building to gain a reputation, one that no one dared to challenge. The once peaceful neighborhood grew uncomfortable, the atmosphere thick with fear. Residents moved out one by one until only a few remained, too frightened to leave but unable to endure the terror. The apartment building, once a quiet and welcoming place, became known as the haunted house on the block, a place where the living could still hear the echoes of the dead. And in the dead of night, if you listen closely, you can still hear Sarah's voice calling for forgiveness. The mournful cries of a soul trapped between the living and the dead, forever bound to the apartment that had once been her home and her tomb. As the weeks passed, the fear in the building grew palpable. The once quiet hallways, filled with the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting, now stood empty and silent. The residents, who had once been friendly and welcoming, now avoided each other's eyes, moving quickly past the second floor as if the very air there was cursed. The echoes of Sarah's ghost were impossible to ignore. It was a place tainted by sorrow, a place no one dared to stay after dark. The building's remaining residents, what few there were, convened in secret meetings, their voices trembling as they discussed what to do. The rumors of the black cat, the spirit of Sarah that seemed to linger in every corner, had driven them to the brink. The strange occurrences were no longer limited to Alex's apartment. Now, the entire floor seemed to be suffused with an otherworldly presence, an oppressive weight that made it impossible for anyone to feel safe. Fearing for their safety, the residents made a unanimous decision. They would block off the second floor entirely, sealing it from the rest of the building. No one could go up there. No one could disturb whatever spirit haunted the place. The building's management took immediate action. The elevator, once an easily accessible means of transport for all residents, was now restricted. It could only be used to reach the second floor in the case of an emergency, and even then, only with the building's manager's permission. The stairs to the second floor were barricaded, the door locked with a heavy, unyielding padlock. But even with the physical barriers in place, the building's curse could not be so easily contained. The black cat, a creature that had come to symbolize Sarah's tormented soul, continued to roam the building's hallways late at night, its mournful cries, a sound that sent chills down the spines of anyone who heard it, echoed through the walls, signaling that the ghost of Sarah was still present, still trapped in her sorrow. No one dared go near the second floor. Neighbors across the building now spoke in hushed voices, avoiding the very mention of the place. They had heard the tales, the whispers of the cries in the night, the sight of the black cat, eyes glowing in the darkness. No one wanted to be the next victim of the haunting that had claimed Sarah's life. The apartment had become infamous not just in the building, but in the entire neighborhood. The building was now known as the haunted house on the block, a place that no one dared approach, especially after the sun set. The residents who remained could feel it in their bones. This was a place that would never be the same. The building had died in a way, its spirit withered by the tragedies it had borne witness to. And now it stood as one of the most haunted locations in all of Santa Cruz. Locals avoided it at all costs, crossing the street to steer clear of its decaying exterior. They would look up at the windows on the second floor and swear they saw shadows moving behind the curtains. They would hear the cries of the black cat and feel an icy chill creeping down their spines. But no one dared go inside. No one dared approach the place where Sarah's spirit still lingered, calling out for forgiveness. The haunted apartment building stood as a grim reminder of the price of regret and the dark, inescapable reach of the past. And as the years passed, the building continued to decay, its windows dark and lifeless, while the whispers of Sarah's tragic story remained a part of Santa Cruz's eerie folklore. As the tale of Alex and Sarah's haunted apartment fades into the dim light of the past, it's important to remember that what you've heard isn't just a ghost story. It's the chilling truth. This haunting, the restless spirit of Sarah, is not born from fiction. No, it's based on real events, events that have left their mark on the very foundation of that apartment building. The locals, those who still remember the horrors that took place within those walls, are too terrified to even speak of it. To this day, they avoid walking near the building, crossing to the other side of the street if they have to pass by, afraid that they'll hear the cries of the black cat or see the shadowy figure at the window. The tragedy of Alex and Sarah serves as a bitter warning. It shows us the dangers of neglecting the ones we love, of allowing the darkness of betrayal to poison a relationship. It reminds us that in the silence of our mistakes, the pain we cause can fester, and sometimes it leads to irreversible consequences. It was in the neglect of their bond, the failure to communicate, that Sarah found herself alone, desperate for connection. And it was in the betrayal, the broken trust, that Alex's life was shattered beyond repair. The story stands as a solemn reminder to all of us. Love is fragile. It's not to be taken for granted. And when one is left unheard, unloved, or betrayed, the wounds can cut so deep that they leave a permanent scar. In Sarah's case, that scar has never healed, and her spirit still wanders in search of the forgiveness she never received. Sarah's ghost, they say, still haunts that second floor. She roams the hallways at night, calling out for Alex, hoping to somehow find the redemption that has eluded her. Her restless spirit cannot move on until she is forgiven, until the man who abandoned her, betrayed her, acknowledges the deep hurt she carried in silence. But it's too late now. The apartment building, once a place of life and love, is now her prison, locked away, forgotten. Her cries unheard by anyone but the living who dare to step too close. Before we part ways, let this tale linger in your mind. If you've made it this far, you've heard the story of a love lost, a soul trapped, and a building that we'll never forget. It's a tale that serves as both a warning and a lesson we should all heed. But before you leave, let me remind you of something. If you want to hear more chilling, true stories, if you want to dive deeper into the mysteries that linger in the dark corners of our world, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. More true, bone-chilling horror stories await, tales of ghosts, curses, and lost souls. We've only just begun to scratch the surface. And remember, never take your relationships for granted. Never let trust be broken, for the consequences can haunt you long after the wounds have healed. Let Sarah's story be a reminder of the power of our actions. Love is fragile. Cherish it, protect it, and never forget that every choice you make leaves a mark on those who matter most. Good night, and beware the whispers of the haunted apartment. You never know when they might call your name.